Hello and welcome to The World This Week. It's been a week that's seen the International Criminal Court issue arrest warrants for the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. They're accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, alongside the Hamas commander Mohammed Deif. The news was met with a furious reaction from the Prime Minister's office, calling it biased, absurd, anti-Semitic. The impact of the warrants will in part depend on whether ICC members decide to enforce them.
This decision is a binding decision, and all states parties of the court, which include all members of the European Union, are binding to implement this court decision.
It's been a week that's seen the rules of the conflict change in Ukraine. After months of reluctance, US media reports that President Biden relented and gave permission for Kyiv to use American long-range missiles and strike deep into Russian territory. Britain and France appear to have followed suit, with reports their jointly made Storm Shadow Scalp cruise missiles were used on Wednesday. But no out-and-out confirmation. The watchwords: strategic ambiguity. Russia responded. President Putin said it was a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile.
Потому что средств противодействия такому оружию на сегодняшний день
there is no means of countering such weapons today. The missiles attack targets at Mach 10, that's 2.53 kilometers per second. The current air defense systems available in the world and the missile defense systems being created by the Americans and in Europe cannot intercept such missiles.
подобные ракеты не перехватывают.
And in the midst of war in Europe and the Middle East, it's been a week where world leaders met in Latin America to focus on other threats to the planet: global warming and world hunger, with a focus of formal talks at the G20 in Brazil. But it was in the corridors and briefing rooms that the dominant issue was made clear by diplomats. Preparations to deal with a man who wasn't there, yet is impossible to ignore. Trump 2.0 on the horizon, and talk of transactional geopolitics replacing consensus agreements. Welcome to The World This Week. Alongside me on the panel to analyse the past 7 days and consider the next 7, we start in Ukraine. Martin Fornesek, the senior news editor at the Kyiv Independent. Martin, great to have you on the programme this evening. Tell us about your week. You've been looking at shadow fleets of ships shipping Russian oil.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been definitely an eventful week in Ukraine. The biggest story, of course, of the week was, as you mentioned, the strike with ATACMS and Storm Shadow that was given permission on Sunday. We see that this was taken after much hesitation, after many attempts in Kiev to convince the Western countries to give permission to use these weapons. And I would say that it was a decision that should have been taken a long time ago, at the moment when Ukraine had larger stockpiles of these weapons and before Russia was able to prepare and adapt. I would say that at the time it would be much more effective, and we will see how it develops.
There's still developments, rhetoric coming in from Moscow and in Brussels as well as we speak. We'll get onto that in just a moment. Great to have you with us, Martin. Let's go to London as well. We have Patrick Smith, the editor, Africa Report, friend of the programme. Evening, Patrick. Thank you for being with us. What have you been focusing on this week?
Greetings, evening. Well, 2 or 3 things. There have been the elections in Senegal, and the overwhelming victory for the young team of Ousmane Sonko, the Prime Minister, and Faye, the president. And then we've got elections coming up in Namibia and Ghana. So we're looking at those. But also what has been going on in Baku in Azerbaijan at the COP29 summit, which is sort of linked to the G20, I think. And I have to say right now they still don't seem to have reached an agreement there, but it's a big disappointment for developing countries.
You've nicely teased what we'll get into in a moment as well, Patrick. Great that you're here. With me in the studio, Celestine Bolen, the independent journalist, former foreign correspondent, including Moscow correspondent for the New York Times. Great to have you here with us, Celestine. Talk me through what stories surprised you, what has made you think perhaps the most this week.
I think without doubt the situation in Ukraine, both the American decision, which, as we were saying, was long awaited and perhaps overdue, but at the same time, I think bigger news was what the Russians did in response. And, reading some of the commentary out of Moscow, I mean, people are taking it seriously, even though, yes, he bluffs, he has bluffed, he will bluff. But at the same time, certain steps are taken. This is an intermediate range missile that he's testing, probably was developed in violation of what was the INF agreement, which President Trump pulled out of. But anyway, I mean, the point is they're showing off. It seems to have succeeded. Not all their missiles always work, but this one did, unfortunately. And I think it puts the whole situation on another level of escalation. I mean, each time it goes up, and now we're at another, position. So I think it's worrying.
It is hard to ignore a bluffer who's a nuclear threat, isn't it? Celestine, great to have you with us too. And Gil Mahili is here, Editor-in-Chief of the French news magazine Causeur. Gil, thank you for joining us too. Talk me through your magazine this week. What have you been focusing on?
Well, I personally was working on the Lebanon war, what's happening in this arena. There are talks about maybe an agreement that is being negotiated, and the situation on the terrain, and back and forth with French politics, still trying to buckle up a budget. Very difficult. Where to cut? Will it be more taxes? Will it be less government expenditure? So we were talking about that too.
Okay, and we're also going to cover some of those issues as well. I think it's part of the G20, big farmers' protests here in France as well this week. Great to have you all here. Well, it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Israel, 1 o'clock in The Hague, when the news broke the International Criminal Court had issued arrest warrants for the Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, accusing them of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. Almost 6 months to the day since prosecutors at the ICC first issued a request for their arrest alongside the Hamas leaders. The response from the Netanyahu government was apoplectic, biased, absurd. They called the ICC chief prosecutor corrupt and the judges motivated by anti-Semitic hatred, and stated there was a false moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas. A nod to the fact that the ICC had also issued a separate warrant for a Hamas military commander, Mohammed Deif, but it's not clear whether he is still alive. This is what the statement said. There are reasonable grounds to believe a lack of food, water and electricity, fuel and specific medical supplies created conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of part of the civilian population of Gaza, resulting in the death of civilians, including children, due to malnutrition in hydration too. In addition, by intentionally limiting or preventing medical supplies and medicine getting into Gaza, and specific anesthetics, and 2 individuals responsible for inflicting great suffering by means of inhumane acts of persons in need of treatment. The consequences are clear for 124 countries that follow the jurisdiction of the court. They are being called upon to, quote, live up to their commitments. Something made clear by Josep Borrell this week, the EU Foreign Affairs chief, a few hours after the news broke.
It is not a political decision. It is a decision of a court of justice, of the International Court of Justice. And the decision of the court has to be respected and implemented. This decision is a binding decision, and all states parties of the court, which include all members of the European Union, are binding to implement this court decision.
Okay, very clear, very sober from Josep Borrell, and what duties countries must have to adhere to. Gil, assess for us how you see the magnitude of this moment.
It's a big blow. In Israel, someone qualified it as a judicial, diplomatic 7th of October. And people are quite shocked, even though it's not a huge surprise. As the correspondent said 6 months ago, the conclusion of the court made it quite clear that it will be very difficult to avoid this outcome. what is really grave about this decision is that it qualifies Israel as a non-democratic state because the court do not intervene when it believes that the country concerned has a judiciary system that can take care of this kind of allegation by itself. Since they do intervene, it means they don't think that the Israeli judiciary system is independent and can investigate and prosecute and punish, if need be, Israelis responsible for war crimes. And this is very, very serious.
Celestine, I saw the Peace Now organization very active within Israel saying that this will make Israel more of a pariah state. Quote, "It's time for the government to resign," was their statement. What do you make of that?
I mean, I guess, you know, that's what a lot of people have been hoping for, the resignation of the Netanyahu government for the same reasons, not without the court's sort of ruling. So I think it leaves it pretty much exactly where we were before. I think the interesting thing about the democratic and non-democratic state is so many of these judgments by the court have been made against countries that, yes, indeed, are not democratic, but they also tend to be in Africa and parts of the world which were beginning to think that they were being targeted and that those sort of developed democracies were getting a pass. I mean, you know, different rules for different folks. This kind of puts a lie to that. So in that sense, I think it's also important as a sort of a precedent. I mean, we should also mention that Vladimir Putin has also been accused and would be arrested if he went anywhere. And the result is he doesn't go everywhere. So, I mean, I think that's also the solution for Netanyahu is he will travel less, but the situation will change only if the political situation in Israel changes, and that hasn't happened yet.
He's very interesting as a wanted fugitive and takes us to G20. There's no Vladimir Putin this week. Patrick, very interesting what Celestine said about we're used to seeing this with African leaders. Talk us through this, because if I remember rightly, ex-President al-Bashir of Sudan was subject to a similar process. He flouted it by persuading a number of African countries to host him.
That's right. He controversially went to South Africa when Jacob Zuma was president. And then the courts in South Africa, showing their independence, then heard a request for him to be arrested, counter to the government's invitation for him to attend a summit in South Africa. And an arrest warrant was issued by the courts in South Africa for al-Bashir. So I think South Africans at that stage were rather proud that their judiciary had defied their government, you know, and the separations of power held. And I think, your speaker's dead right. There's a real anger across Africa that only African officials and a couple of heads of state, in fact, have been targeted by arrest warrants by the ICC, and that hasn't extended to other leaders around the world. Now we've got Putin and now Netanyahu in the net. And I think given the anger across Africa, particularly in countries with a majority Muslim population about what's happening in Gaza, I think they will actually show a lot more support for the ICC. But of course, at the same time that the ICC's winning support there, they're going to be losing a lot in America, particularly among the Republicans in Congress. So and I think there's a move afoot now to declare the ICC an illegal organization, to bar the prosecutor from travel. We've been there before, but it's going to be very interesting how the US play this, particularly with the new administration under Donald Trump.
I think that's a central point, isn't it, Gil? That you've got the response from countries, the test to their faith in the ICC, these countries in the West particularly that show that they have, or say, an adherence to international law. We're already seeing the Hungarian Prime Minister today saying, "You're welcome, Mr. Netanyahu," despite the fact that they have signed up to their own treaty as part of the ICC.
Yes, and the British said that they will consider how to proceed. They didn't say, like the French or the Dutch or the Canadians, that it will apply, of course. So I guess there will be other countries. I wanted just to remind everyone that before the ICC existed, there were ad hoc tribunals, and one of them dealt with the war in Yugoslavia. So statistically, they don't have an African bias. And one of the African leaders that was judged was acquitted. So, and we can understand that they have this principle of complementarity, and there are very few countries in Africa, they exist, but there are very few countries in Africa where you can say that they have a judicial system capable of dealing with it, so we don't have to intervene. So it's not as they think about the color of the skin, but it's about the quality of the institution, and it's comprehensible.
Celestine, is it worth just mentioning President Trump's administration at this point as well? Because I think his incoming national security advisor, Mike Waltz, has said there will be a strong response to what he called the anti-Semitic bias of the ICC in the UN. And worth saying that the US is not part of the signed up to the Rome Treaty in the ICC. What do you make of the comments from the world's superpower?
I mean, you know, first of all, as you say, I mean, key fact is that the Americans have not didn't join under Democratic and Republican administrations. So, you know, they're not a player. And so talk is cheap, you know. I mean, he can say and condemn it because it makes points back home with, you know, people, I mean, with, okay, Jewish voters, but people who are sympathetic to Israel anyway. And again, I mean, it's a game of shadows on both sides, I think, at this point.
Martin, a game of shadows on both sides. In Kyiv, just talk us through what the relationship is like between President Zelensky and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it is worth saying Ukraine is not party to the International Criminal Court also, is it?
Well, Ukraine was trying for years to reach out to Israel, to secure support from them. President Zelensky has been often pointing out that Iran, which is currently the main rival of Israel and supporting militant groups attacking Israel, is also a close ally of Russia. President Zelensky has been trying to present this as the struggle between the democratic world and against the dictatorship. And we have seen some changes, maybe some developments recently. Certain Israeli companies more open with cooperating with Ukraine, for example, learning experience how to counter drones. But the relationship between Israel and Ukraine has been difficult and has been mainly based on Ukraine trying to Israel to stand behind Ukraine, to join this pro-Kiev coalition, and this effort have been often not very successful.
Well, Martin, that takes us on to Ukraine, and let's look at what's been happening this week. It was a grim milestone. On Tuesday, 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. Addressing the Ukrainian parliament, President Zelensky said the war reached a decisive moment. He urged, quote, resilience. He ruled out holding elections until peace had been resolved once again. He also spoke of plans to massively ramp up production of strike weapons and long-range drones. What he didn't say in Parliament was what was happening on the battlefield at the same time, that Ukrainian troops had, for the first time, been firing US-made long-range missiles into Russian territory, aptly called ATACMS. The US official told reporters that one had struck a weapons depot near the town of Karachev in Russia's Bryansk region, about 70 miles from Ukraine. A change in the rules of combat, confirmed on the ground days after the US media reported President Biden finally gave the green light to use them deep inside Russia, despite months of reluctance over whether it be seen by Russia as an escalation, potentially ratcheting up the nuclear threat. It was a move welcomed by President Macron, speaking to reporters in Brazil at the G20 summit.
Our strategy and doctrine are based on strategic ambiguity, and I think it's essential to make this decision. I think it's a very good decision.
A very good decision, in which a day later, on Wednesday, British supplied cruise missiles, aka Storm Shadow or Scalp, jointly made with the French, also reported to have been fired into Russian territory for the first time. Reuters news agency saying that, quoting British sources on that, no official word from Downing Street or the White House, perhaps there won't be, takes us back to this strategic ambiguity line, as President Macron said. But come Thursday evening, we had the first announcement from President Putin of what had happened earlier in the day, that his forces hit the eastern city of Dnipro. He described it as a new type of weapon system, and he gave this sudden, unexpected address to the nation.
Мы считаем себя вправе.
We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities. And in the event of an escalation of aggressive actions, we will respond decisively and reciprocally.
И зеркально.
I recommend that the ruling elites of those countries that are hatching plans to use their military contingents against Russia seriously think about this.
Свои воинские контингенты.
Martin, let's start with you in Kyiv. Talk us through the feeling tonight politically, and just talking of those amongst you of fear, of relief that the Americans have got involved. Just talk me through the reactions that you've been hearing today.
Well, as we had set milestone on 1,000 day of the full-scale war, it's of course a sense of great anxiety, great anticipation. The situation at the front is currently very difficult. Russian forces are advancing at a pace long unseen. So the permission to use ATACMS, to use Storm Shadow, is of course a welcome step, even though, as I said before, it was expected much earlier when it would have much greater potential to deal damage to Russian forces. One positive thing I see about this, how it can benefit the most, is to help Ukrainian forces hold on in Kursk Oblast, the Russian border region, which Russia is preparing to retake with the help of North Korean allies. And I believe that if Ukraine manages to hold on to Kursk Oblast, it can be a great benefit in any potential future negotiations as a very useful bargaining chip. So this I see as the most immediate benefit of ATACMS of Storm Shadow missiles permitted to be used on Russian territory.
Gil.
If we try to understand what was the Biden administration strategy in Ukraine by analyzing what they did, not what they said, they actually managed to get what they wanted. They wanted Russia neither to win nor to lose. The nightmare in Washington was that Russia becomes a kind of Iraq, with it falls apart. It's a mess. It's going to be a center for violence, private armies, and it will be horrible. So they prefer working with the Putin they know, rather than to find themselves with an Iraqi situation. On the other hand, they didn't want him to win because all the implication it has on NATO, Poland, the Baltic states, and they didn't want to embolden Putin. So we can say that after 1,000 days, they got what they wanted. And I think that in the United States, quite early, their idea of victory, which is not the idea that the Ukrainians had, is that to have an essential Ukraine, which means an independent regime, independent institutions in Kiev, most of the territory, and Odessa. You got these three things, you can say that they won, because what Putin wanted in February of 2022 is to transform Ukraine into Bielorussia. He's far from achieving that. So I think this is the way we should consider. We can criticize it, but I think that this is what Biden, Blinken, and the rest of them wanted to happen.
Yeah, so on the one hand, we've got this back in 2014, the Minsk agreement, which is not even worth the paper it's written on now, those boundaries that Russia said it would stick to, they didn't. And then you fast forward to the situation in recent weeks, US military analyst Celestine talking about, 18% of territory they now have, hundreds of thousands of deaths, go back to October, 1,500 deaths a day, according to American military analysts, and no immediate end in sight. So it seems to be that both sides are kind of positioning themselves in conflict as well for where these potential talks might go. Now, you're a seasoned Moscow watcher. You spent many years there. Tell me two things. Firstly, the calibrations President Putin might be making right now, the missiles he's using too. How do you see that?
I mean, again, I think, this is, again, partly a game of bluff. It's also putting down markers. Sometimes those two things are the same. I would say that he does see talks. I mean, at the end, it will end in talks. I mean, there pretty much isn't any war anywhere that didn't end that way. The talks produce different results. In Korea, for instance, there never was, a peace treaty, whatever. So I sort of agree with you, but not entirely, in the sense that the situation as it is kind of a nightmare. You know, it's sucking money. It's politically very sort of increasingly unpopular in the United States, certainly with Trump at the helm. In Europe too, it's a problem. So it's got to be solved. And Putin, I think both sides are sort of playing the clock here a little bit. You know, that they want to get to the point where they're at the table. And the question is, what do they come to the table with, and what do they hope to take away? I mean, I do think, and I think that a lot of people, and the correspondent of the Kiev Independent would know better, but it seems that there is fatigue in Ukraine, and a lot of people are looking to, you know, getting rid of the Donbass. It's not the most beautiful part of Ukraine. I'm not being cynical, but I mean, the fact is, it's been a bloody part. It's cost everybody a lot of lives and money and material. So, you know, maybe not what he claims, which would be something of a defeat for Putin. I mean, he's claiming the 4 oblasts, and he doesn't control that. So maybe what he controls, which is less. I think Crimea, you know, I think for the Russians, Crimea is pretty much I mean, I don't see them walking away from this war without Crimea.
Well, it's interesting. Brian Lanza, one of the close aides, the campaign organizer for Donald Trump, saying that, and Martin, you'll be well aware of this, saying that if President Zelensky wants Crimea, then you're on your own. Good luck with that. Essentially saying that that's not what this peace talks are going to be about. Martin, the other thing that strikes me, I was talking to retired US General Ben Hodges, I should say, who was Commander-in-Chief of the US Army in Europe 2014 to 2017, and he said this: there is no existential threat for Vladimir Putin. He's not fighting for his country, he's fighting for an extension of what he would like to see, to which he doesn't believe there is a nuclear threat. Now, that's okay coming from where he is in Berlin. Do you feel that? Do you feel that how far this ratchets up has a limit?
If the question is about it, if I feel that some kind of nuclear response is imminent, then no. I don't see, of course, into Vladimir Putin's head, and I don't deny that somewhere down the road there might be some kind of, let's say, sabotage at the occupied Zaporizhia plant. But this strike that happened, which was with a missile, which was an adapted version of an intercontinental missile, which was capable of carrying nuclear warhead, I see this more in line with this saber rattling, which was happening since day one of the full-scale invasion. This has been something that Putin said during the speech when he was announcing the full-scale invasion, was that if the West crosses this red line or that red line, there will be repercussions, there might be nuclear repercussions, and it never materialized. I see this use of this new weapon as something that Putin had to do as a response to ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes that will be loud enough to appear in media headlines, to spark panic, to spark tension, to spark this fear of a nuclear war, while at the same time not being something that will be seen as direct confrontation of the US. Like, we even saw that Russians warned the US that the strike is going to happen. So I see this very much in line in what has been happening throughout the war.
Patrick, you've covered a lot of conflict around the world over the years. Would you be surprised to learn if, when Donald Trump met with Joe Biden, those fireside talks for the predecessor handing over to the successor, that they didn't talk about what was coming with the long-range missile green light during that hour of conversation?
I would be surprised. I mean, it was, I think, a shockingly civilized conversation from the external point of view. I mean, these two are presidential contenders that have slagged each other off in public, accused each other of being corrupt and beyond the pale, sitting down, shaking hands in the White House over a cup of coffee. I think the big question behind what you're asking is Biden, by giving Ukraine the ATACMS at this stage, is he helping Trump set up some negotiations post January 2025, or is he trying to sabotage Trump's negotiations by actually strengthening Ukraine's hand? And I think it looks more like the former. He's actually trying to shore up Ukraine, but also to make sure that it's got something. If Ukraine finds itself in negotiations, it's got something to trade. And I guess Putin read that, and that's why he's come back with the hypersonic missiles to try and up the ante on his side. And I think it sort of behoves both the US and Britain and Europe in general to keep up the pressure at this point, because it's a critical point for Ukraine if it really is going to go into those negotiations. And the question someone raised, I think Celestine, about the Donbass. I mean, you're looking at a Ukraine with 20% occupied by Russia. If Russia succeeds in its attempt to grab back the territory that Ukraine is occupying at the moment and extend itself in eastern Ukraine, it could go into a putative set of negotiations with 25% of Ukraine. Well, that's not the whole caboodle, but it's an awful lot of territory, and it would really strengthen Russia's hands in negotiations, and that's the problem. I think the final thing I would like to say is that Trump, for all the confident forecasts that he's going to pressure Zelensky to hand over Ukraine, he's also got to look at his own persona in the world. Does he want to go down in history as the guy who presided over Ukraine's defeat to Russia? And I think that's going to be a very, very difficult diplomatic puzzle for him to solve. Just how much of his own reputation is tied up in this? We're not even talking about the ethics, but I think we're talking about Trump's personal political standing.
It's very useful, actually, just while you're speaking about the Trump presidency and what we're dealing with in terms of missiles, for some context for France 24 viewers. Let's just try and show you the difference between these missiles we're talking about. Let's start off with the British missiles that have been given the green lights. We were told this week, look at the range of those. Storm Shadow Scalp, as the French call them, up to 250 kilometres, speed of 1,000 kilometres an hour. The suitably named ATACMS, up to 300 kilometres of range, 3,700 kilometres an hour. The US ballistic missiles, green lighted this week, and now we're looking at the Oreshnik, the hypersonic Russian missiles, experimental missiles, says Putin, up to 5,000 kilometres, huge range, 10,000 kilometres plus an hour. Vladimir Putin saying that is around 3 kilometres per second. So, Martin, that perhaps explains some of the concern. Vladimir Putin claiming that there's no way to shoot these down. Western analysts would disagree with this. Martin, briefly, one other thing to mention to you is North Korea in this. Analysis from South Korea today suggesting that there is anti-air defense missile systems being offered to Pyongyang. Also that they've got something like 100 million barrels worth of oil as well from the Russians, quid pro quo for their troops being used.
I think that the key thing about this is that the provision of oil is something that breaches UN sanctions. And these UN sanctions were imposed because of North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile systems development. And we have seen Russia consistently undermining UN sanctions that are supposed to prevent North Korea from developing nuclear weapons. Earlier this year, Russia vetoed the renewal of UN monitors of sanctions. And we also heard that Russia provided nuclear technology to North Korea in exchange for soldiers, for ammunition, etc., etc. So we see how the two countries effectively drive the escalation mutually, both in Europe and in the Korean Peninsula.
OK, well, let's take us from the situation in Ukraine to where many leaders were still talking about that in Rio de Janeiro, late afternoon on Monday, as world leaders gathered for the family photo, a memorable summit with a moment of Sugarloaf Mountain as the backdrop. There was a Where's Waldo moment for viewers watching the G20 coverage live, a Where's Wally challenge for the British, Où est Charlie to the French, and to the Americans, where's Joe Biden? He turned out he wasn't there. Let's listen as it becomes evident that he was missing.
Where was he? They're telling Biden, they're telling him to wait for Biden, guys. Oh my God.
Nobody's waiting. OK, also missing, and perhaps not causing the same drama, Canada's Justin Trudeau, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, both late. A US security official said to reporters there was, quote, a logistical issue that proved a challenge to Team Biden. So it wasn't because of the presence, they said, of Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign secretary there. But perhaps this accidentally illustrates a bigger picture, that nobody felt the need to wait for the most powerful leader in the world, because they're really waiting for his successor and they're preparing for a new geopolitical reality of Donald Trump coming down the track in 6 weeks' time. Still, an opportunity for the G20 president, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, to have 48 hours with a captive audience of heads of state and leaders, a moment for him to set the agenda amongst the largest economy in the world. Formal talks on combating global warming, alleviating world hunger, and a proposal to tax the wealth of the super rich. Gil, okay, when we look at G20s, the dynamic is actually fascinating because it's not necessarily the agenda, it's the bilaterals, it's the meetings with so many different countries. What resonated for you from this week's G20?
The larger picture for me is the bankruptcy of the United Nations. Between the G7, the G20, the BRICS, and all kinds of other Shanghai group, we see that what was supposed to be carried by the United Nations is now being handled by other groups because people are not, or nations around the world are not satisfied with the United Nations. I think it's very important. Probably the United Nations will become a kind of a facade, a kind of a prestige area with little or any influence, and the real business will be held in other forums like the G7, the Shanghai Group, or the Shanghai Forum, or the BRICS, or even the G20. As for this G20, I mean, the timing was really, really bad. The most important person was not there, and he's not in power yet. He's not in office yet. It's Donald Trump, and the war in Ukraine changed pace with the American decision and the Russian reaction, and obviously everyone there spent much of their time and energy working on formulas to hide that there is a profound disagreement about the Ukraine-Russia situation, not to mention the war in the Middle East. So I think for this time we can say that the main achievement was that it took place.
And also for the host, Celestine, for Brazil and President Lula, it's an interesting geopolitical dynamic where you have perhaps an uncomfortable situation with possibly the vice president in all but name of Elon Musk and Donald Trump, when we had the First Lady calling, well, saying an expletive to Elon Musk, an insult over their history that they have over X and Twitter's alleged misinformation dispute in Brazil, also the Starlink satellites all over the place. You have Brazil seemingly even cozier relations with China as well right now going on. What are you making of how President Lula was managing the G20?
You know, I mean, I agree with Jill in the sense that I think it's, you know, it's about who is there and who is talking, and he was the presiding officer, so to speak. I mean, I think it's always prestigious to have these things, and you get lots of photos with lots of other big shots, and that's always good. I mean, in the managing of on the sidelines, I mean, I don't know about the treaty with that South America is trying to sign with Europe, with France. Did that progress in any way? I don't get that impression. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting on Mercosur, isn't it? Because we've had all week, as we mentioned a moment ago, the French farmers making clear they're against this, but then President Macron saying that he went to Buenos Aires first, spoke to Javier Milei, the president, and said that he's against this for the French. But then we look at the Germans and Olaf Scholz, and they're saying that they're looking at a date in December. There was nothing in the communique to seal that deal.
But it
looks
was
like
all in the side.
Yes.
I just wanted to add one point. I mean, I think it's interesting to say that the UN is not what anybody hoped it would be, and that's been ever more true since Russia has become, you know, aggressive and violating the very basic rules of the UN. But I think the interesting thing is none of these other groups even pretend to deal with questions of war and peace. So, you know, they deal with trade, they deal with relations, they deal with management, maybe a bit of climate change and a tiny bit of energy and a bit of this and that. But war and peace, they're not taking it on. And that means that the only one that is left, for all of its faults, is the UN. And I think, you know, call it a talk shop or whatever, you know, at least people are getting in the same room. And that hasn't produced anything this time, but it's not nothing in the sense that there's been nothing to replace it.
Patrick, that's a very interesting point from Celestine, isn't it? And perhaps central to the G20. If you have, and I mentioned it earlier, the idea of a transactional geopolitics with Donald Trump, less about consensus, less whether focusing at the G20 on some of the wars of the world, which actually is advantageous to the likes of China, who don't talk about that. They just want to talk trade. So it's a difficult position. And also, you're seeing this with African leaders in their second summit for the African Union, isn't it, for the G20 this year?
Yeah, that's right. The African Union is an official member of the G20 alongside the European Union with full rights of the European Union. So in Africa, that's seen as some sort of progress. I think I'd probably side with Celestine in the debate about the UN versus these other forms of multilateral organization right now. I think we just have to accept the fact that multilateralism is probably as frayed as it's been since the end of the Second World War in the current sort of geopolitical climate. So it's not surprising that the UN is weakened. I'm not convinced that certainly the G7 or the G20 are terribly strengthened either, or even NATO. I mean, these organizations are pretty seriously divided too. I mean, the difference is that the UN has a raft of agencies that are engaging in development and economic activities around the world and setting laws and all the rest of it. And there is an active process, and it was discussed at the G20, to reform the workings of the central body in the UN Security Council, and to give seats on that council to countries such as, permanent seats on that council, to countries such as India, Japan, and 2 seats for African countries. I think that would be a huge step forward. I think the other point about the G20 is that Lula is handing over to South Africa for the first time next year. South Africa will be hosting the G20 summit. Cyril Ramaphosa says he's looking forward to inviting Donald Trump to South Africa to play golf. Ramaphosa is apparently not a brilliant golfer, but South Africa has a really good roster of world-class golfers. So Trump may be tempted to come. So maybe we'll see some South Africa golf diplomacy when it chairs the G20.
He may not want to come because he'll lose, and that's not something he enjoys doing. So
exactly, and also just thinking back about
he doesn't want to be a loser. I think
now we have the golf after the ping pong diplomacy.
I think Ramaphosa might well have a word.
Carry on, Patrick.
Sorry.
Ramaphosa may well have a word with any potential competitor with Trump to suggest that he actually has an off day when he plays Trump.
It will be interesting, Gail. I just very, very briefly, we have about 15 seconds, just the idea that world leaders right now will be brushing up on any golf skills that they have or haven't got for the sake of having 5 minutes and knowing actually that's what matters to the leader of the world's superpower.
Well, ping pong contributed to a breakthrough in the 70s. Maybe golf will do the same in the 2020s.
I know Emmanuel Macron plays.
Does Putin play golf? I don't think so.
I wouldn't have thought so. He goes horseback riding half naked, doesn't he? Celestine, thank you so much to the panel alongside me this week. In London, Patrick Smith, editor of the Africa Report. In Ukraine, Martin Fornasek, the senior news editor at the Kyiv Independent. And as you can see in the studio with me, Celestine Bolen, globetrotting independent journalist, formerly of the NYT, and Gil Mahili, editor-in-chief at French magazine Causeur. Thank you for watching. And now we can't go without quickly mentioning Jaguar. Firstly, tributes to the man once nicknamed Two Jags. Former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, John Prescott, who died this week, aged 86. The nickname stuck after it emerged the Labour politician drove 2 Jaguars. Journalists later changed it to 2 Jabs after he famously punched a man on the campaign trail for throwing an egg, later saying he did it because Tony Blair told him to better connect with people.
As he walked through them, a local man chucked an egg at him almost at point-blank range. John Prescott immediately swung round and landed a punch straight on his jaw. The man then wrestled the Deputy Prime Minister onto his back and held him down over a small wall as police and Labour Party officials tried to release him.
John might actually have got rid of his Jags altogether back in the day if the company brought out the latest advert while he was in office. If you've seen it, well, the car maker's latest campaign, Copy Nothing, has gone viral, testing the old adage, there is no such thing as bad publicity. A 30-second video shows no cars, mainly models wearing colourful outfits, slogans such as create exuberant, live vivid, delete ordinary. Several newspapers say it is the worst ad of the year of all time, according to one. Well, see for yourself. Don't forget to live vivid, and see you in 7 days for the world next week.